How do you plan an art project? Well, I think it's probably going to be easiest if I actually walk you through one of mine and how I planned it, how I worked through it. A lot of the pieces that I've worked with for the last couple months have been ink related. This all kind of started with Inktober 2023. I've done several years of it prior, but this was the first year where I really sunk my teeth in and did something consistent throughout the entirety of the project. So I'm going to start with that. And I'm going to start with the example because I really feel like examples give you something to understand. It's really easy to talk in a lot of ethereal terms, to use widespread language that is hard to understand when you are trying to hone in on a particular topic. So let's take a look at my planning process for a particular ink piece. The first thing you have to start with is the goal or the prompt. Obviously with Inktober, there is an actual word that you have to stick to, but sometimes you have to create this yourself. And that's probably the first thing that you want to do when you're designing a project. Project, of course, being different from practice or an assignment of some kind. This is something that you've devised or you've been given as an assignment from a class to focus on, to work on. It might be something as large as a comic or a book. It might be something as simple as focusing on a portrait. It doesn't really matter, but you have to define right out of the gate what is the goal. What is your destination on this path? Once you have that goal, start to break it down, chew on it a little bit so you can understand exactly where you want to go. So the piece that I'm going to take a look at was one of the first Inktober prompts from last year, and it was golden. My sketches for this were kind of all over the place. I was trying to work through the basics of the idea, figure out how I wanted to represent the character, if I wanted to use the same character that I'd used for the last couple pieces, and I was trying to figure out how I wanted to get this image put together. You can see on the sketch that things are kind of all over the place until I settled on one particular position that I wanted to show the character in. From there, I was able to work out a composition in a really small thumbnail, and fortunately that thumbnail nailed it for me. I knew, I didn't mean on having the pun there, sorry, but it really just did exactly what I needed it to, and I was able to then take that and transfer it immediately into a sketch. I'll take just a second here and show you some of the other sketches for some of the other prompts, and you can see some of them are very different from what I landed on. Look at this map one, for example. The originals had this character who is stabbing a map or even pointing to a map on the wall, and I ended up with a character, the same character, standing in front of a map that was kind of dimly lit in an underground cavern. Very, very different, but again, this is what sketching does for you. This is what the sketching phase is. And so that's where I want to move on to next. The overarching goal with sketching is to answer all of the questions that you need to answer before diving into the actual project. For me, this is figuring out the components I want to include, figuring out which of them need to be references, and how I want to capture this idea in general. In this piece, for example, I was trying to figure out the best way to set up the image. After the initial sketching, I'll go out and I'll find references. I think this is an important part here, especially if you're working on a project. Often you will stay away from references when you're working on imagination drawing and things like that. But if you're working on a project and you're really concerned with making it accurate to your end goal, logically you're going to need references a lot of the time. For this particular drawing, I used references from some children's books on how characters were oriented. I looked up a whole bunch of alchemical symbols. I looked up concrete and rock and stone and how they would be represented in this sense. I'm not sure that I looked up any references for the wood on the floor, but I've looked up references for those kinds of things very many times, so I didn't necessarily need to. But for some projects, I will assemble 20 to 30 different references. Sometimes I'll even put them in a folder on my phone or in the cloud so I have access to them on multiple devices. References can be your lifeline as you work through something. At this point, I might go back and do some additional sketching. I don't want to make it sound like I overdo the sketching, but once you have your references, you might have to go back and readjust some things. In this case, I took a look at some of the things having to do with the clothing and the details, how I might want to represent the hatching, but there wasn't a lot on this particular drawing. In some drawings, though, there's a ton where my initial compositional sketches will give me the idea that I want to go after, but then my references will dictate that I need to go spend a lot more time really thinking through how I want to represent this and how the references are going to come into play. So don't feel ashamed or embarrassed if you have to go back and you have to do some more referential work, some more sketching to learn those references before you really dive in. This is also the time where I will focus on composition, really nailing down how I do it. You can see in some of my sketches that the composition often gets expanded, that I mess with it after I've laid down my initial lines. I also try to work on some of the harder questions to answer. Where should things be oriented? Should the character be in the center of the frame or not? It's often kind of a bad idea to center things, but it's a tendency that I have from my graphic design background, so I have to fight it a little bit. This is also a good phase to look for help if you need it. I have a couple people in my life that I will send things to if I don't know how to get that limb or those hands to look just right. So don't fear asking for help. The next step is sketching out the final piece. And you'll see this if you look at any of my Inktober pieces. When I actually start filming them, the whole initial sketch is done. I'll usually start by laying down the borders and then very loosely working in the shapes of where things need to be. I don't have to get all of the details. What I'm really working on is nailing down the hard to define shapes and where the main locations of things are. I don't need to put in all of the shading, for example. It's just not relevant. When I take ink over the top, it's pretty easy to just work that in. This is predominantly about proportions and composition. Once I have the sketching done, I'm ready to move into the final and start actually using ink. I usually begin by working with a pretty fine point pen, laying down difficult shapes, focusing on the most important parts. I do this starting with the most important integral components because if I make a mistake here, it carries the most weight. If there's any point at which I'm going to need to restart, it's if I mess up the fundamental details. So I usually start with them so that I have the opportunity to restart if I need to. I don't usually need to, but I like having that back door in case things go wrong. I like a plan B. This alleviates some stress and it makes my life easier. I will then go through and trace out most, if not all, of the pencil lines. I'll let this dry and then I'll erase the pencil lines. At this point, most of the stressful and hard work is done, and so I will either start blacking in the large areas or working on the hatching to create three-dimensionality. But again, at this point, the work is tailored toward the specific goal of the piece. For most of the Inktober pieces, I had no plan of coloring, so I did full shading on them, using mostly hatching to do so, varying my use of pens and markers, the width of which makes a sizable difference in how things are laid out on the page. At this point though, it's just working through till the end. I stop every once in a while, kind of put the image off a little bit further away from me, and check and make sure everything's working. I try to do this frequently because if something goes awry, I want to catch it as soon as I possibly can. And things do go awry sometimes. Sometimes they're adjustable, sometimes they're not, and you just have to live with it. So that is my basic pen and ink process. I probably left something out, but as I'm going through and building this and editing it, I will try to include anything. And if you notice something that you want to hear more about, something that I left out, or something that you do, please leave it in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. As always, thanks for your time. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.